They said a man could survive anything out west except silence. And Elias Turner had been living with silence for so long that even the floorboards in his ranch stopped creaking for him. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you still believe kindness matters more than pride out in this hard world, stay with me for this story, because what happened on that lonely Arizona ranch in the winter of 1878 was something folks around Dry Creek still whisper about whenever the wind starts pushing dust beneath the saloon doors. The night Elias bought himself a wife, the desert air felt colder than usual, sharp enough to sting the lungs. The trader arrived after sundown with a wagon that groaned like old bones across the frozen dirt road. Elias stood on the porch holding a lantern low by his side, while the horses snorted steam into the darkness. Nobody in town asked questions anymore when strange wagons stopped at his property. Men avoided the ranch. Women crossed the street when they saw him riding into town. Not because Elias Turner was cruel. Worse than that, he was empty. 43 years old. 6'2". Shoulders bent from years working cattle alone beneath brutal Arizona suns. His beard had gone gray before its time, and the lines around his eyes looked carved there with a knife. Folks said his house hadn't heard laughter in over a decade. Maybe they were right. The trader climbed down slowly, rubbing his hands together. "She's Apache," he muttered like it was a warning instead of a fact. Elias gave a small nod. He already knew. The woman stepped down from the wagon without help. Thin, quiet, wrapped in a dark wool blanket covered with road dust. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. Her black hair hung loose beneath the cold wind, and there was something strange about her eyes. Not fear, not anger, just distance. Like her mind had been standing somewhere else for a very long time. She carried only one thing, a small leather bag tied tightly against her chest with a faded cord. Elias noticed immediately how firmly she held it. Like letting go would kill her. The trader cleared his throat awkwardly. Her name's Nayeli. She never looked at either man. Elias handed over $12 in folded bills. The trader counted them fast, eager to leave. No ceremony, no blessing, no smiles. Just money changing hands beneath a dead moon while cold wind rattled the fence posts. The trader climbed back into the wagon and paused before leaving. "One more thing," he said quietly. "She don't sleep much." Then he snapped the reins and disappeared into the darkness. Elias watched the wagon lights vanish down the trail until only the sound of the wheels remained. Beside him, the Apache woman stood silent beneath the porch lantern. Dust moved across the yard like ghosts. Somewhere beyond the stable, a horse kicked wood nervously. Elias finally opened the door. "House gets cold after midnight," he said. "There's stew on the stove." Nayeli stepped inside slowly. Her eyes moved across the room without curiosity. The small ranch house smelled like smoke, leather, and old coffee. One table, one stove, one Bible gathering dust near the window. The kind of place built for surviving, not living. Elias removed his hat and hung it beside the door. "Rooms down the hall." She gave no answer. Didn't even look at him. She simply walked past carrying that leather bag pressed against her chest. A few minutes later, Elias heard the bedroom door close softly. Then silence returned to the ranch. The old kind. The heavy kind. Outside, wind scraped against the walls while the temperature dropped close to 20 degrees. Elias sat alone at the kitchen table drinking black coffee gone cold hours ago. He stared at the lantern flame trembling on the table. Strange feeling having another soul beneath his roof after all these years. Strange enough that sleep refused to come. Around midnight, the horses suddenly began making noise outside. Restless. Nervous. Elias frowned. He grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. The wind hit hard immediately, carrying sand and winter cold across the open land. Then he saw her. Nayeli was curled beside the stable wall beneath a thin blanket, lying in the dirt beside the horses as if she belonged there more than inside the house. Elias froze. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he called over the wind. She sat up slowly but said nothing. Her face looked pale beneath the moonlight. "You'll freeze to death." Still no answer. Elias walked closer, boots crunching hard dirt. The horses shifted uneasily behind her. He noticed something then. Her hands were shaking badly, but not from cold. Fear. Real fear. The kind that settles deep in the bones. Elias lowered his voice. "There's a bed inside." Nayeli finally looked up at him. Her eyes reflected silver beneath the moonlight. empty and wounded all at once. Then she whispered the first words Elias Turner had heard from her all night. "I don't sleep inside houses anymore." The wind howled across the ranch after she said it, carrying dust through the dark Arizona night. And for the first time in years, Elias Turner felt something colder than loneliness settle into his chest. Morning came hard over Dry Creek, cold sunlight crawling slowly across the empty land like it did not want to touch the ranch either. Elias Turner was already awake before dawn, sitting alone at the kitchen table with yesterday's coffee reheated on the stove. The house smelled faintly of smoke and dust. Outside, wind pushed loose sand against the walls in soft, scratching waves. He could hear the horses moving in the stable and the distant creak of old fence posts shifting under the cold. For 10 years that sound had been his only company. 10 years since another voice had lived beneath his roof. 10 years since another plate sat on the table across from him. Men in town thought loneliness made a man softer with age. They were wrong. Out on the frontier, loneliness hardened people the way winter hardened river mud. Quiet became a habit. Then it became a prison. Elias stared at the second bowl he had placed on the table without thinking. Steam drifted from it slowly. Oatmeal. Plain. No sugar. He frowned at it for a long moment before finally standing and pulling on his coat. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. Strange sound. Almost unfamiliar now. He stepped outside into air cold enough to sting his teeth. The sky above Arizona stretched pale and empty, with long ribbons of gray cloud dragging low over the desert. Hills. The ranch looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Broken wagon wheel near the barn. Rusted water trough. Chicken coop leaning sideways from old storms. Nothing changed out there. Nothing except the woman sleeping beside his horses. Nayeli sat awake beneath a wool blanket near the stable wall. She had already risen before sunrise, silent as smoke. One of the Mares stood beside her calmly while she brushed dirt from its neck with slow, careful movements. The horse barely moved. Elias noticed that immediately. Animals trusted people long before humans did. "You should have come inside," he muttered while approaching. Nayeli kept brushing the mare. "I slept fine." Her voice sounded low and rough, as though unused for months. Elias glanced at the frozen dirt beneath her blanket. Ground dropped below 20 degrees last night. She shrugged lightly. Still warmer than some places. That answer stayed with him longer than it should have. Elias walked into the stable without another word. The smell of hay and leather wrapped around him instantly. Familiar. Safe. He began saddling his chestnut gelding while morning light slipped through cracks in the barn walls. Behind him, he could hear Nayeli moving quietly among the horses. No wasted movement. No nervousness. Like she had spent years around animals. Most folks in Dry Creek thought Apache women were wild or dangerous. Elias never cared much for town gossip, but watching her now, she looked neither wild nor dangerous. Just tired. Deep tired. The kind sleep alone could not fix. He carried 2 buckets toward the water pump outside. Nayeli stepped forward before he reached it. "I can do that." Elias shook his head once. "I have done it alone this long." The words came out colder than he intended. Nayeli simply stepped back. No anger. No hurt. That bothered him more somehow. Around mid-morning, Elias rode the fence line, checking for storm damage while wind swept across the open plains in long, low whistles. Dry brush rolled through the dirt like drifting skeletons. 20 acres stretched around him, empty except for cattle and silence. This ranch had once belonged to his father, then to him, and one day the desert would probably swallow it whole. Elias knew every inch of that land, every broken rock, every crooked fence nail. But lately the place felt heavier, like the emptiness itself had weight. By noon he returned to find smoke rising from the chimney. He slowed his horse immediately. Nobody cooked at his house except him. Inside, the ranch smelled different. Beans simmering. Fresh bread heating near the stove. Nayeli stood near the counter grinding coffee beans by hand, while sunlight touched one side of her face through the dusty window. She still carried that small leather bag tied around her shoulder. Even indoors. Even while cooking. Elias removed his gloves slowly. "You did not have to do this." "The flour was there," she answered softly. The stove was warm. He looked at the table. 2 plates set neatly beside each other. For some reason, that simple sight unsettled him more than finding her outside in the freezing dark. Elias sat carefully across from her. The old chair creaked beneath his weight. Nayeli remained standing while pouring coffee into chipped tin cups. Her hands trembled slightly when she lifted the kettle. Barely noticeable, but Elias noticed. Years working cattle taught him to spot weakness in living things before anyone else could. "You sick?" he asked bluntly. She froze for half a second, then continued pouring. No, Elias narrowed his eyes. The lie sat between them like smoke. A moment later, she turned away suddenly, pressing her fist lightly against her mouth. A dry cough escaped her chest. Short, controlled, but deep enough to sound painful. When she lowered her hand again, Elias caught the faintest glimpse of red against her knuckles before she wiped it quickly into her skirt. Silence filled the room instantly. Outside, wind rattled the loose shutters against the house. Nayeli kept her eyes lowered. Elias stared at the table for several long seconds before finally speaking. "There is a doctor 20 miles east in Blackstone. Doctors cannot fix ghosts," she whispered. Elias looked up sharply after she said it. But Nayeli had already picked up the coffee cups and walked toward the sink. The leather bag bumped softly against her side. With each step, and for the first time since she arrived at the ranch, Elias Turner began wondering what kind of sorrow could make a woman fear warm beds more than winter cold. 3 days passed before Elias Turner realized the ranch no longer sounded dead. It was small things at first. The scrape of a chair moving before sunrise. Soft footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. The steady crack of firewood being stacked beside the stove. Sounds so ordinary most folks would never notice them. But on that lonely patch of Arizona dirt, they felt strange enough to stop a man in his tracks. Elias noticed all of it. He just pretended he did not. The weather turned colder as December settled deeper across the territory. Frost covered the fence rails every morning now, and thin sheets of ice formed along the edges of the water trough before noon sunlight melted them away. Wind never stopped out there. It carried dust through every crack in the ranch house, covering shelves and windowsills in a fine layer of pale brown sand. Nayeli cleaned it anyway, quietly, patiently, like someone trying to care for a place that had forgotten how to be lived in. Elias returned from repairing the north fence late one afternoon with his gloves stiff from cold and his shoulders aching from work. The ranch house glowed faintly through the dusk, warm lantern light flickering behind the curtains. He slowed his horse without meaning to. Strange sight. That house had looked abandoned for so long that seeing light in the windows almost felt wrong. Inside, the smell of stew filled the air. Real stew, thick with potatoes and beef and herbs he could not name. Nayeli stood near the stove, stirring the pot slowly while steam curled around her dark hair. She still wore the same faded wool blanket around her shoulders, even indoors. And always that leather bag rested against her side. Elias hung his coat beside the door. "You cook like somebody's grandmother," he muttered. Nayeli glanced at him briefly. "That is not an insult where I come from." The corner of Elias's mouth almost moved. Almost. He sat heavily at the table while she filled 2 bowls without another word. Outside, evening wind rattled the loose shutters against the house. Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried across the darkening hills. Elias ate quietly for several minutes before speaking again. "Town's talking." Nayeli kept her eyes on the stove. "People always talk. They say I lost my mind bringing an Apache woman here." She nodded once like she expected nothing different. "And what do you say?" Elias wiped his mouth slowly with the back of his hand. "I say folks in Dry Creek ought to mind their own damn business." Silence settled between them again, but it felt different this time. Less sharp, less cold. Nayeli finally sat across from him with her bowl untouched. Firelight flickered softly across her face, and Elias noticed how tired she looked tonight. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Skin pale beneath her copper complexion. She had barely eaten for 2 days. "You need food," he said. "I am not hungry. That cough says otherwise." Her fingers tightened slightly around the spoon. "You watch too much." Elias leaned back in the chair. "Hard not to. You cough every morning before sunrise because you think I cannot hear it through the walls." Nayeli lowered her eyes. The fire cracked softly between them. "It is only the cold." Elias stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood without another word and crossed toward the stove. He poured hot water into a tin cup before adding whiskey from a dusty bottle near the shelf. A little honey after that. Rare thing for Elias Turner to waste honey on anybody. He set the cup beside her carefully. "Drink." Nayeli looked surprised for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Not grateful. just surprised. Whiskey is not medicine. No, Elias answered. But neither is freezing yourself beside horses every night. She hesitated before finally wrapping both hands around the warm cup. Her fingers trembled lightly from cold or weakness or both. Elias moved toward the window while pretending not to watch her. Outside, darkness rolled slowly over the desert plains. The ranch fences disappeared first, then the stable, then the open land itself until only blackness remained beyond the lantern glow. He heard Nayeli cough softly behind him. Longer this time. Rough enough to make her catch her breath afterward. Elias frowned toward the window. Doctor and Blackstone fought pneumonia through 2 winters, he said quietly. Man stitched up half this territory. Nayeli gave a faint shake of her head. Doctors only keep bodies alive. Elias turned slowly toward her after hearing that. And what exactly gave you the idea yours is already dead? For a moment she did not answer. Firelight danced across the room, while wind moaned softly outside the house. Then Nayeli looked down at the leather bag resting in her lap. Her thumb brushed across the worn edge carefully, almost lovingly. Some things burn long after the fire is gone, she whispered. Elias followed her eyes to the bag. The old leather looked weathered and cracked from years of use. He had seen her sleep holding it against her chest. Seen her carry it into the stable, even to the water pump. Whatever sat inside mattered more to her than food or warmth. Elias considered asking about it. Instead, he reached for his hat. Need to check the horses. Nayeli spoke before he reached the door. Why did you really bring me here? Elias stopped. The question lingered heavily in the room. He kept his back toward her for several seconds before answering. Because silence gets loud after enough years. He stepped outside before she could reply. Cold air struck him immediately. The stars above Arizona looked sharp enough to cut skin tonight. Elias crossed toward the stable slowly, boots crunching frost beneath each step. But halfway there he paused. Through the ranch window, he could see Nayeli sitting alone by the fire, holding that leather bag tightly against her chest. Not eating, not moving, just staring into the flames like she expected them to speak back. And for the first time in a very long while, Elias Turner felt something dangerous beginning to return to that lonely old ranch. Concern. If you have made it this far into the story, leave a like and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Snow came early that year. Not the heavy mountain kind that buried rooftops for weeks, but thin bitter sheets of white carried sideways by hard desert wind. By the second week of December, the hills around Dry Creek looked pale beneath the moonlight, and every rancher in the territory started preparing for trouble. Winter out there did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, through frozen water buckets, aching hands, and long nights that seemed to last forever. Elias Turner spent most of those days repairing the western side of the stable before the real storms arrived. The old wood groaned under every gust now. One strong blizzard could tear half the roof loose if he left it alone. He worked from sunrise until dark with rough hands and stiff shoulders while cold air cut through his coat like needles. Nayeli rarely spoke while helping him, but somehow she was always there, carrying nails, holding lanterns, feeding the horses before he asked. She moved across the ranch softly, almost soundless against the wind, yet Elias had started noticing the emptiness whenever she disappeared from sight. That realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One afternoon the sky turned dark before sunset, thick storm clouds swallowing the last sunlight over the desert plains. Elias climbed down from the stable roof with frost clinging to his beard. His knees cracked from the cold when his boots hit the dirt. Nayeli stood beside the water pump filling buckets slowly while her long black hair whipped violently across her face in the wind. The leather bag rested against her shoulder as always. Elias had stopped wondering why she never let it out of reach. Some people carried grief in their eyes. Others carried it in objects too heavy to put down. Storm's coming fast, he called. Need to get inside before dark. Nayeli nodded faintly, but halfway toward the stable, she suddenly stopped walking. One hand gripped the wooden fence beside her. The other pressed tightly against her ribs. Elias frowned immediately. Nayeli. She waved him off without looking up. I am fine. Then the cough hit her, harder than before, deep enough to bend her forward while cold air rattled violently inside her chest. Elias crossed the yard quickly. By the time he reached her, she had already turned away, wiping her mouth against her sleeve. But not before he saw blood again. More this time. bright red against the pale wool fabric. Wind howled through the yard while Elias stared at the stains silently. Naeli stepped back at once. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" he asked quietly. "Like I am already buried." Her voice cracked slightly beneath the wind. Elias looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You need that doctor." "No. You can barely breathe." I said no. The sharpness in her voice surprised both of them. Naeli turned immediately and walked toward the house through the blowing snow. Elias stood alone beside the fence while storm clouds rolled overhead like dark waves. He had seen sickness before. Ranch life guaranteed that much. Men froze, coughed themselves weak, worked until their lungs failed from dust and cold. But something about Naeli frightened him differently. Maybe because she carried her pain too quietly, like somebody already preparing to disappear. Night arrived fast after that. Wind slammed against the ranch house hard enough to shake the shutters while snow drifted across the porch in pale spirals. Elias sat near the stove sharpening a knife slowly, though his attention never stayed on the blade long. Across the room, Naeli knelt near the fire feeding small pieces of wood into the flames one at a time. She looked exhausted tonight, shadows beneath her eyes deeper than before. Every few minutes that dry cough escaped her chest again despite her efforts to hide it. Finally, Elias set the knife down. "You got family somewhere?" Naeli stayed quiet for several seconds. "No, nobody. Nobody left." The fire cracked softly between them. Elias leaned back in the chair, studying her carefully. "You ever think maybe you are carrying too much alone?" Naeli looked toward the flames instead of him. "You bought me because you were alone too." Elias could not argue with that. Wind screamed outside the house while snow tapped against the windows like small fingers. For a while neither spoke again. Then Naeli suddenly asked, "Why did your wife leave?" Elias stiffened slightly at the question. He had not heard another person say those words inside this house for years. "She died," he answered flatly. Naeli looked up slowly. Elias stared into the fire while speaking. "Fever took her during summer. 15 years ago." The room fell silent again except for the wind outside. After that, Elias continued quietly. The ranch stopped sounding like home. Naeli watched him carefully now. Something softer moved through her expression for the first time since arriving there. Not pity. Understanding. She lowered her eyes toward the flames again. "Fire changes places," she whispered. Elias looked toward her after hearing that. Fire again. She kept returning to that word like a wound she could not stop touching. Before he could ask another question, a violent gust slammed against the house hard enough to rattle the entire frame. The horses outside began kicking nervously inside the stable. Elias stood immediately. Damn storm's getting worse. He grabbed his coat and lantern before stepping toward the door. "Stay inside tonight," he warned her. "No stable. No sleeping outside." Naeli said nothing. Elias hesitated briefly before leaving anyway. Snow struck his face instantly as he crossed the yard toward the stable. Wind roared across the open plains now, fierce enough to nearly kill the lantern flame. Inside the stable, the horses shifted nervously while loose boards groaned overhead. Elias checked each stall carefully before finally stopping near the back wall. There, hanging from an old nail beside the tack room, he noticed something strange. A small line of symbols scratched into the wood. Fresh marks. Not there before. His eyes narrowed. He lifted the lantern closer. The carvings looked deliberate. Apache symbols maybe. One shape repeated 3 times beside another mark that resembled flames. Elias stared at them uneasily while cold wind slipped through cracks in the barn walls. Then behind him, somewhere beyond the storm outside, he heard Naeli scream his name for the very first time. The sound of her voice cut through the storm sharper than the wind itself. Elias dropped the lantern hook immediately and rushed out of the stable into swirling snow. Cold air slammed against his face so hard it nearly stole his breath. The ranch yard had vanished beneath white dust and darkness. He could barely see the house through the storm. "Naeli," he shouted back, fighting the wind as he pushed toward the porch. Another cry reached him then, weaker this time. Not fear. Pain. Real pain. Elias hit the porch steps fast enough to shake snow loose from the railing. Inside the ranch house, the lantern beside the stove had fallen sideways across the floor, casting crooked shadows against the walls. Naeli was on her knees beside the table, one hand gripping the edge hard enough to whiten her knuckles while the other pressed against her chest. Her breathing sounded rough and uneven. Elias crossed the room immediately. Easy now. She tried to stand before he reached her. Stubborn even now. But her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Elias caught her by the shoulders before she hit the floor. For a second she froze under his hands like a frightened horse. Her body felt ice cold despite the fire burning nearby. I am fine, she whispered through shallow breaths. That is becoming a very poor lie. Snow hissed against the windows while the ranch house creaked beneath heavy wind. Elias guided her carefully toward the chair beside the stove. Nayeli resisted at first, weak pride still fighting somewhere inside her, but another coughing fit bent her forward before she could protest again. Elias grabbed a clean cloth from the sink and handed it to her without a word. When she lowered it seconds later, the fabric carried small dark stains across the center. Blood again. More than before. Elias stared silently at the cloth. Nayeli quickly folded it closed in her hands. Do not. Her voice sounded almost ashamed. Do not look at me that way. Elias crouched slightly beside her chair, elbows resting on his knees. Woman, I buried enough people in this life to know sickness when I see it. Firelight flickered softly across her tired face. Then you know there is no fixing some things. Elias looked toward the storm beating against the windows. Maybe, but sitting in freezing weather every night sure as hell is not helping. Nayeli closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. Her breathing slowly steadied while silence filled the room again. Outside, the stable doors banged loudly against the wind. Elias finally stood and tossed another log into the stove. Flames rose higher instantly, painting warm gold across the dark cabin walls. You are sleeping inside tonight, he said firmly. Nayeli opened her eyes. No, this is not a discussion. You do not understand. Elias turned toward her slowly. Then explain it. The room went still except for the crackling fire. Nayeli lowered her gaze toward the leather bag hanging against her side. Her fingers curled tightly around it. Inside walls, she whispered softly. They hold memories. Elias frowned. Memories do not freeze a person to death. Some memories already did. He watched her carefully after she said that. Something in her voice felt different tonight. Not guarded anymore. Tired. Like the storm outside had worn down whatever strength she used to keep the past buried. Elias moved toward the cupboard and poured hot coffee into 2 cups. The smell drifted warmly through the room. He placed one beside her gently. Drink. Nayeli wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat settle into her skin. Her fingers trembled badly now. Elias sat across from her at the table while snow continued piling against the porch outside. How long you been sick? He asked quietly. Nayeli stared into the coffee. Since spring. And you never saw a doctor? A faint bitter smile crossed her lips. Apache women do not get welcomed into many doctor offices. Elias had no answer for that. The truth sat heavy between them. Out on the frontier, kindness depended too often on skin color and last names. He hated that part of the territory. Always had. But hating something and changing it were 2 different things. Nayeli coughed again, weaker this time. Elias noticed sweat shining lightly across her forehead despite the cold room. Fever. Damn it. He stood immediately and crossed toward the hallway closet. After digging through old shelves for several moments, he returned holding a thick quilt stitched with faded blue thread. He paused briefly before handing it to her. Nayeli looked surprised again. This belonged to my wife, Elias said quietly. Warmest blanket in the house. Nayeli touched the fabric carefully like it might break apart in her hands. You should not give this away. I did not. Elias nodded toward the chair. I loaned it. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, something changed in her expression then. Small. Almost invisible. But there. The hard distance in her eyes softened for just a heartbeat before disappearing again. She wrapped the quilt slowly around her shoulders. Elias looked away afterward, pretending to fix the fire poker near the stove. Men like him did not know what to do with tenderness once it entered a room. Outside, the storm worsened. Wind screamed across the plains while snow buried the ranch fences 1 inch at a time. The horses stomped nervously in the stable. Elias checked the windows twice before finally speaking again. You are taking the bed tonight. Nayeli shook her head immediately. No, you can barely stand. I said no. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose. Then tell me something honest for once. She looked at him carefully now. Firelight danced softly across her tired eyes. If I sleep inside, she whispered, I see fire. Elias said nothing. I smell smoke, she continued softly. I hear walls breaking. Her grip tightened around the leather bag resting in her lap. And I hear my little boy calling for me. The room went completely silent after that. Even the storm outside seemed farther away somehow. Elias stared at her for several long seconds without moving. Little boy. Those words settled deep inside the old ranch house like something sacred and painful at the same time. Nayeli lowered her head slowly afterward, ashamed tears glimmering faintly in the firelight, though none fell. Elias looked toward the stove, jaw tightening hard beneath his beard. Then, without another word, he walked to the corner of the room, lifted his own bedroll from the floor, and carried it toward the front door. Nayeli looked up immediately. What are you doing? Elias grabbed his coat from the hook. Sleeping in the stable. In this storm? House is yours tonight. He paused with one hand on the door before adding quietly, nobody should fight ghosts. Alone. Then he stepped out into the freezing Arizona night while behind him, for the first time in many years, the lonely ranch house no longer held just one wounded soul. The storm lasted through the entire night. Wind rolled across the Arizona plains like a living thing, clawing at the ranch house walls and rattling every loose board on the property. Snow piled against the stable doors in crooked white drifts while the horses shifted nervously inside, their breath rising warm into the freezing dark. Elias Turner barely slept at all. He sat wrapped in an old canvas coat near the stable lantern with his hat pulled low over his eyes, listening to the storm and thinking about words he had not expected to hear inside his house. I hear my little boy calling for me. Those words stayed with him until sunrise. Some pains had a way of settling into the bones of a place. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold. The storm weakened just before dawn, leaving the ranch buried beneath a thin layer of wind-blown snow that glittered beneath pale sunlight. Elias stepped outside the stable slowly, boots crunching frozen dirt beneath him. Every breath burned his lungs. The ranch house chimney still carried smoke into the sky, curling softly against the winter air. He stared at it longer than necessary. Strange comfort in seeing smoke rise from that house again. Strange enough that it almost hurt. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. Nayeli stood beside the stove, feeding more wood into the fire while the old blue quilt rested around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but different somehow. Softer around the eyes. Less guarded. Her dark hair hung loosely over one shoulder. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she looked less like a stranger passing through and more like someone trying to stay alive there. Elias removed his gloves carefully. You sleep any? Nayeli nodded faintly. A little. He studied her face for a moment. Nightmares. She looked toward the fire instead of answering. That told him enough. Elias grabbed the coffee pot and poured 2 cups in silence. The ranch house felt unusually quiet this morning, but no longer empty. There was a difference. Empty felt cold. Quiet felt human. Nayeli accepted the coffee carefully with both hands. You should not have slept in the stable, she said softly. Elias shrugged once. Slept worse places. Still, he leaned against the counter, staring out the frost-covered window. Storm did not tear the roof off. That counts as a good night around here. A faint smile almost reached her lips again before disappearing. Elias noticed that too. Every small change. Every crack in the wall she kept around herself. Outside, sunlight slowly spread across the snow-covered fields while distant mountains stood pale beneath drifting clouds. The ranch looked cleaner after storms like this. The desert always did. As if winter buried old footprints for a while. Nayeli suddenly coughed again, turning away sharply before she could stop herself. Elias saw her steady one hand against the table afterward while trying to catch her breath. Damn it, he muttered quietly. You are getting worse. I have had harder winters. That does not answer me. Nayeli lowered her eyes. Some roads do not turn back, Elias. He hated when she spoke like that. Like someone already halfway gone. Elias sat slowly at the table across from her. You got family buried somewhere. Nayeli hesitated before answering. Near New Mexico. Your boy too? Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Silence stretched between them. Then she nodded once. Elias looked down at the table. He knew enough about grief to stop asking questions after that. Some stories came out only when they were ready. Pushing never helped. Wind brushed softly against the windows now, calmer than before. Somewhere outside, one of the horses snorted inside the stable. Familiar sounds. Honest sounds. Elias finished his coffee and stood. Town needs supplies. Flour. Lamp oil. Nayeli looked up immediately. Dry Creek. Closest place around. Something uneasy moved across her face. People there do not like my kind. Elias grabbed his coat from the wall hook. People there barely like anybody. Still, he paused while pulling on his gloves. You staying here alone? Nayeli looked toward the fire quietly. I have been alone a long time. Those words landed heavier than she intended. Elias stared at her for several seconds before finally reaching into the cupboard beside the stove. He pulled out an old revolver wrapped carefully in cloth and placed it on the table. Nayeli looked surprised. I do not know how to use that. Hope you do not need to. Elias adjusted his hat low across his forehead. But coyotes get brave in winter. Nayeli touched the revolver carefully without lifting it. You trust me with this? Elias shrugged lightly. If you wanted me dead, plenty of chances already. For the first time, a real smile appeared briefly across her tired face. Small and sad and gone almost immediately, but real enough to change something in the room. Elias looked away afterward, uncomfortable with how much that smile affected him. Men who lived alone too long forgot how dangerous kindness could feel. Before leaving, he stopped near the door and glanced back once more. Nayeli sat quietly beside the fire with the old quilt around her shoulders and the leather bag resting in her lap. Morning light touched one side of her face softly through the dusty window. The sight stayed with him longer than it should have as he crossed the snowy yard toward his horse. Dry Creek sat 12 miles east beyond the frozen hills. Long ride through winter wind. Elias mounted the saddle slowly while clouds drifted low over the desert plains. But just before pulling the reins, he noticed something strange near the porch steps. Footprints. Fresh ones. Not his. Not Nayeli's. Large boot prints half covered by snow leading away from the ranch house toward the open desert. Elias frowned immediately. Somebody had been near the property during the storm. Somebody watching. He stared at the tracks silently while cold wind moved across the empty land. Then his eyes slowly lifted toward the ranch window. Nayeli stood inside watching him now, one hand resting tightly against that leather bag. And for the first time since she arrived, Elias Turner realized the ghosts following her might not all belong to the past. Thank you for staying with this story until now. Elias Turner followed the footprints for nearly half a mile before the wind erased them completely. The trail curved north through frozen brush and low desert grass before disappearing among the rocks beyond his property line. Whoever had stood near the ranch during the storm knew how to move quietly. That bothered him. Most men around Dry Creek stomped through life loud enough to announce themselves from 2 streets away. But these tracks felt careful, patient, watching. Elias sat still on horseback for several seconds while cold wind pushed snow across the empty plains. The morning sky had turned pale silver now, stretching wide and lonely over Arizona territory. Somewhere far off, a hawk circled above the cliffs. Everything else remained silent. He finally turned the horse east toward Dry Creek, though his mind stayed behind at the ranch. The ride into town took nearly 2 hours through frozen trails and drifting snow. Elias kept his coat collar pulled high against the wind while his horse pushed steadily through the cold. Dry Creek appeared slowly beyond the hills around noon. Same dusty streets. Same leaning storefronts. Same tired little town trying to survive another hard winter. Smoke curled from chimneys above the saloon and blacksmith shop, while wagon wheels creaked over frozen mud roads. Men standing outside the general store looked up as Elias rode in. Their conversations lowered immediately, not because they feared him, because folks always stared when loneliness finally brought someone back among people. Elias tied his horse near the mercantile and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. Every board groaned beneath his boots. Inside the store smelled like flour, leather, and tobacco. Shelves stood crowded with canned peaches, coffee tins, lantern oil, and winter blankets shipped in from New Mexico weeks earlier. Old Mr. Hargrove looked up from behind the counter while polishing his glasses. Thought that storm buried your ranch for good, he muttered. Elias grabbed a sack of flour without smiling. Not today. Hargrove leaned closer slightly. Town says you brought home an Apache woman. There it was. Elias kept packing supplies into a crate. Town talks too much. Folks are curious. Folks ought to find hobbies. Hargrove chuckled under his breath, but lowered his voice afterward. You be careful, Elias. Some men around here still carry old bitterness. Elias looked toward the frosted window beside the counter. Across the street, 3 cowboys stood near the saloon porch watching the store quietly. One of them, Clyde Mercer, had a face shaped by whiskey and bad opinions. Elias knew the type well enough. Men who blamed strangers for every disappointment in their lives. They can carry whatever they want, Elias answered coldly. Just not onto my property. Hargrove studied him carefully after hearing that. You sound protective. Elias grabbed another coffee tin from the shelf. I sound tired. But even he knew that was not entirely true anymore. He paid for the supplies in silence and carried the crate outside into sharp winter sunlight. The moment he stepped onto the sidewalk, Clyde Mercer spat tobacco into the snow near his boots. Heard you sleeping beside Redskins now, Clyde said loudly enough for half the street to hear. Elias kept walking toward his horse. Move along, Mercer. Clyde grinned crookedly. Careful. Folks might think loneliness made you soft. The other men laughed quietly behind him. Elias stopped beside the saddle. Wind drifted cold through the street, while horses snorted steam into the air. Slowly, Elias turned back toward them. You know the difference between soft men and quiet men, Clyde? Clyde's grin faded slightly. Elias rested one hand calmly against the saddle horn. Quiet men usually give you a chance to walk away. Silence spread across the sidewalk. Even the laughter stopped. Clyde stared at him for several long seconds before finally stepping back toward the saloon porch. Winter makes people strange, he muttered. Elias mounted his horse without another word and rode out of town beneath a sky growing darker by the hour. Snow clouds gathered again over the western hills. Another storm coming. Halfway back to the ranch, Elias noticed something else troubling him. Nayeli never asked where he went. Never asked when he would return. Like she had already learned not to expect people to come back for her. That thought sat heavily in his chest during the long ride home. The ranch finally appeared near sunset, smoke rising softly from the chimney against the cold evening sky. Elias immediately noticed the stable lantern already lit. Nayeli must have prepared it before dusk. He dismounted quietly and carried the supply crate toward the porch. But before reaching the steps, he froze. Fresh footprints again. Same large boots. This time closer to the house. Much closer. Elias slowly set the crate down beside the porch rail. His eyes moved carefully across the snowy yard. No horses. No movement. Just silence and wind. He rested one hand near the revolver beneath his coat before pushing open the front door. Warmth spilled out instantly. Nayeli sat beside the stove wrapped in the blue quilt, staring into the fire while snow melted softly from her boots onto the wooden floor. She looked up immediately when he entered. You were gone long. Elias closed the door behind him. Somebody came here. Her face changed at once. Small. Barely visible. But enough. You saw tracks. Twice now. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the fire. Could be hunters. Could be. Elias removed his gloves slowly. But your face says otherwise. Silence stretched through the room. Firelight flickered softly against the walls while wind brushed outside the house again. Finally, Nayeli spoke without looking at him. There are men who do not forget old debts. Elias studied her carefully. What kind of debt? She touched the leather bag resting against her chest. The kind people follow through snowstorms. Elias felt something tighten inside him then. Not fear. Something older. Protective instinct maybe. Strange feeling after years spent caring only about cattle and weather. He moved toward the stove and poured coffee into 2 cups. Anybody comes onto this ranch again, he said quietly. They answer to me first. Nayeli looked up slowly after hearing that. Firelight danced softly in her dark eyes while the storm clouds gathered outside once more. For a long moment neither spoke. Then very quietly, almost like she was afraid to say it aloud, Nayeli whispered, Nobody has said that to me in a very long time. The next storm arrived 2 nights later. Smaller than the first one, but colder somehow. The kind of cold that slipped beneath doors and settled deep into old bones. Elias Turner sat near the stove mending a broken saddle strap while wind brushed softly against the ranch house walls. Across the room, Nayeli rested in the wooden chair beside the fire wrapped tightly in the blue quilt. She had been quieter than usual all day. The coughing came more often now, leaving her pale and exhausted after each spell. Elias pretended not to notice how little she ate at supper. Pretended not to notice how her hands trembled while lifting coffee cups. Men out west learned early that helplessness was easier to survive if nobody spoke its name aloud. But silence had become harder lately, especially inside that house. The fire cracked softly between them, while lantern light painted warm gold across the walls. Outside, the horses shifted restlessly in the stable. Elias glanced toward Nayeli after hearing another cough escape her chest. "You should lie down." She shook her head lightly. "If I sleep too early, the dreams come sooner." Elias lowered the saddle strap into his lap. "What exactly are these dreams?" Nayeli stared into the flames for several long seconds before answering. "A house burning in the dark." Wind rattled the shutters softly. "You said that before." "Because it never changes." Elias watched her carefully now. Firelight reflected in her tired eyes, while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. "Tell me about your boy," he said gently. The room grew still after that question. Nayeli lowered her gaze toward the leather bag resting against her side. Her fingers moved slowly across the worn surface, like someone tracing old scars. "His name was Maddo," she whispered. Elias remained silent. Out on the frontier, a man learned when words only got in the way. Nayeli continued staring into the fire while speaking softly, almost like she was telling the flames instead of him. "He liked horses, even before he could walk." A faint smile touched her lips for only a moment. "There was a gray colt near our village. Wild thing. Nobody could get close to it except Maddo." Elias leaned back quietly in his chair, listening. He would laugh every time the colt stole apples from the baskets outside our camp. Her smile faded slowly after that. Then soldiers came through the valley one winter. The fire popped sharply beside them. Nayeli's eyes drifted farther away now, somewhere deep into memory. People started running. Smoke everywhere. Children crying. Her voice grew softer with every sentence. "I grabbed Maddo and ran toward the river, but..." She stopped suddenly. Elias saw her throat tighten hard beneath the lantern glow. "But what?" Nayeli closed her eyes briefly. "I dropped him." Silence filled the room immediately. Even the wind outside seemed to fade away. Elias stared at her without moving. Nayeli pressed trembling fingers against the leather bag. "There was too much smoke," she whispered. "Too much screaming." Her breathing turned uneven now. "I went back for him. I tried." Elias said nothing. Nayeli slowly opened the leather bag resting in her lap. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she let another person see inside. Elias felt his chest tighten instantly. A tiny pair of burned leather shoes rested carefully folded inside the bag beside a small carved wooden horse blackened by smoke. Child-sized, worn at the edges from years of being carried. Nayeli held the shoes gently in both hands. "This was all I found afterward." The room stayed silent except for the fire. Elias stared at those tiny shoes while something heavy settled deep inside him. He had spent years believing loneliness was the hardest thing a person could survive. Sitting there now, watching the woman beside the fire cradle what remained of her child, he realized grief could become something even colder. Nayeli wiped her eyes quickly before tears fully formed. "After that night," she whispered, "I could not sleep inside houses anymore." Elias looked toward the window while snow drifted softly across the darkness outside. He understood now. The fear, the cold nights beside horses, the panic hidden behind her eyes every time walls closed around her. Fire had stolen more than her child. It had stolen safety itself. "You were alone after?" Elias asked quietly. Nayeli nodded once. "Most people only saw an Apache woman with bad lungs and too many ghosts." She lowered the little shoes carefully back into the bag. "You are the first person who looked at me longer than my scars." Elias swallowed slowly after hearing that. Strange ache in his chest tonight. The kind a man could not fix with whiskey or hard work. He stood from the chair and crossed silently toward the stove. After a moment, he opened a small cabinet near the sink and removed an old tin box covered in dust. He carried it back to the table and set it down carefully. Nayeli looked confused. Elias opened the lid slowly. Inside rested a faded photograph of a woman standing beside a younger version of himself outside the ranch house many years earlier. Beside the photograph sat a tiny silver hair ribbon. "My wife," Elias said quietly. Nayeli studied the picture softly. She was beautiful. Elias nodded faintly. She laughed loud enough to scare birds out of trees. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Drove me crazy." Nayeli looked at the ribbon inside the box. "You kept these all these years." Elias shrugged lightly. Some things you do not throw away. Their eyes met briefly across the firelit room then. No romance. No dramatic moment. Just two wounded souls sitting quietly beneath one roof while winter pressed against the windows outside, understanding each other without needing many words. Then suddenly the horses outside began stomping hard inside the stable again. Elias frowned immediately. Damn animals. But Nayeli had already gone pale. She stared toward the window with fear growing visibly across her face. Those are not the horses, she whispered. Elias slowly stood from the table. Outside beyond the storm, faint bootsteps creaked across the snow near the porch. The bootsteps stopped just outside the porch. Elias Turner stood motionless near the table while the fire cracked softly behind him. Across the room, Nayeli clutched the leather bag tightly against her chest, her face pale beneath the lantern glow. Snow hissed against the windows. Another step creaked across the porch boards. Slow. Careful. Elias moved quietly toward the wall beside the front door where his rifle rested on two wooden hooks. He lifted it without hurry, the same way a rancher picked up a shovel or hammer. Calm hands survived longer out west. Nayeli watched him silently. Do not open the door, she whispered. Elias glanced toward her briefly. You know who it is? She lowered her eyes. That answer was enough. Another knock came then. Not loud. Just 3 slow taps against the wood. The kind that unsettled a man more than shouting ever could. Elias stepped closer to the door. Who is it? For several seconds, only wind answered him. Then a rough voice came through the storm. Name is Silas Reed. Need to speak with the Apache woman. Nayeli's breathing changed instantly after hearing the name. Elias noticed it immediately. Fear. Real fear. He tightened one hand around the rifle stock. You can speak from outside. Silence again. Then the voice answered calmly. Cold night for conversations through doors. Elias stared at the weathered wood in front of him. Something about the man's tone bothered him. Too polite. Too patient. Like someone used to waiting people out. What do you want with her, he asked. The answer came without hesitation. Something she took from me. Behind Elias, Nayeli stood suddenly from the chair. Do not listen to him, she whispered sharply. He lies. Elias slowly opened the small curtain covering the side window beside the door. Snow drifted through darkness outside, swirling around a tall man standing beneath the porch lantern. Long black coat, gray beard touched with ice. One horse tied near the fence rail behind him. No visible weapon. But men like Elias knew danger did not always wear guns openly. Silas Reed looked directly toward the window. His eyes stayed calm. I came a long way through winter for this conversation, rancher. Elias kept one hand on the rifle. Then you can explain yourself. Reed exhaled slowly into the cold air. The woman inside traveled with a wagon train 2 years ago near Santa Fe. Nayeli shook her head immediately. No, her voice trembled now. Please. Reed ignored her. One night, that train disappeared, along with $20,000 in Army payroll. Elias frowned slightly. Snow drifted softly between them outside. And you think she took it? Reed's eyes narrowed. I know she did. Nayeli stepped forward suddenly. That money was never yours. Elias looked back toward her carefully. She pressed the leather bag tightly against her chest while trying to steady her breathing. Silas Reed worked with the men who burned villages across the territory, she whispered. He stole from tribes. From widows. From soldiers, too. Reed gave a cold smile outside the door. Funny thing about thieves, he muttered. They always accuse others first. Elias studied both of them in silence. Wind moaned softly through the porch cracks while firelight flickered behind him. The old rancher had spent enough years around liars to know truth rarely arrived clean. But one thing felt clear already. Nayeli feared this man for reasons deeper than money. Reed shifted slightly beneath the lantern glow. I am not here to hurt anybody, he said calmly. I just want what belongs to me. Elias glanced toward Nayeli again. You got something of his? She hesitated too long. That silence told its own story. Reed noticed too. There it is, he said softly through the door. Thought so. Nayeli suddenly coughed hard into one hand, struggling for breath. Elias stepped toward her immediately while she gripped the edge of the table to stay standing. When the coughing stopped, fresh blood stained her fingers again. Reed saw it through the window. Something changed briefly in his expression then. Not pity exactly. Recognition maybe. She is dying, he said quietly. Nayeli looked toward the floor. Elias stood beside her protectively without thinking. Reed's voice lowered outside. Listen carefully, rancher. That woman crossed paths with dangerous men long before she reached your property. Men who will not stop looking. Snow whipped harder around the porch. Elias rested one hand gently against Nayeli's shoulder to steady her. Then they can stay off my land. Reed studied him silently for several seconds. You really willing to risk your ranch for someone you barely know? Elias looked toward the fire burning behind them. Strange thing about lonely men. Sometimes it took only one wounded soul, sitting quietly in your kitchen to remind you what being human felt like again. He turned back toward the door. Everybody deserves one safe place in this world. Silence followed those words. Even Nayeli looked up at him slowly after hearing them. Outside, Silas Reed lowered his eyes briefly toward the snow-covered porch boards. Then he reached into his coat very slowly. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle immediately, but Reed only removed a folded paper and slid it beneath the door. Read that after I leave. Elias did not move. Reed stepped backward off the porch into drifting snow. If you are smart, he said quietly, you will ask her what really happened near Santa Fe. Then he untied his horse and disappeared slowly into the winter darkness beyond the ranch. The sound of hoofbeats faded beneath the wind until only silence remained again. Inside the house, the fire crackled softly while Nayeli stared at the folded paper lying on the floor between them. Elias finally lowered the rifle. You want to explain any of this? Nayeli closed her eyes briefly. Her shoulders looked smaller somehow now. More tired. Not tonight, she whispered. Elias bent down slowly and picked up the paper from the floor. The seal across the front carried faded army markings beneath melted snow. His eyes narrowed immediately. Then he unfolded it beside the firelight and saw a name written clearly across the top line. Nayeli. The paper trembled slightly in Elias Turner's hands while firelight flickered across the faded army seal. Snow whispered against the windows outside, soft now after the storm had passed, but inside the ranch house the silence felt heavy enough to crack wood. Nayeli stood near the stove, clutching the leather bag tightly against her chest while watching Elias read the first lines. The document was old, folded too many times, water stains along the corners. But one sentence stood clear beneath the lantern glow. Suspected involvement in disappearance of military payroll transport near Santa Fe territory. Elias slowly lowered the paper. You never told me any of this. Nayeli looked exhausted suddenly. Older somehow. Because men stop listening once they hear words. Like thief. Elias stared at her quietly. The fire snapped beside them. Did you steal it? Nayeli closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. No simple answer. No excuses. No long speech. Just one tired word hanging in the room between them. Elias had spent most of his life around liars. Ranchers lied about debts. Cowboys lied about whiskey. Men in towns lied every day just to feel important. But something in Nayeli's voice carried the weight of truth. Maybe because she sounded too tired to protect herself anymore. He folded the paper slowly and set it beside the coffee cups on the table. Then why are people chasing you? Nayeli sat carefully near the fire before speaking again. The wagon train carried army gold through Apache land. Her voice stayed low and distant, like she was walking through memory with each sentence. Silas Reed worked security for that convoy. Most of the money was stolen before the wagons even reached the canyon roads. Elias listened silently. Reed blamed Apache scouts afterward, she continued. Said tribes attacked the transport. Her eyes lowered toward the leather bag. But the men who stole that gold were his own people. Wind brushed softly outside the house while lantern light flickered against the walls. Elias leaned back in the chair. How do you know? Nayeli slowly reached into the leather bag again. This time she removed something wrapped carefully in cloth. Small object, heavy enough to pull her hands downward slightly. Elias watched as she unfolded the cloth beside the firelight. A gold pocket watch rested inside. Army engraving along the back. The initials JC scratched beneath a faded eagle crest. Elias frowned. That belongs to the payroll convoy. Nayeli nodded faintly. I found it after the fire. Elias looked up sharply. The same fire that killed your boy? She swallowed hard before answering. Reed and his men burned our camp searching for the missing gold. They thought Apache families were hiding it. The room went still again. Elias stared at the pocket watch while anger slowly tightened across his weathered face. Not loud anger. The quiet kind. Dangerous because it settled deep. Nayeli's fingers. trembled around the little watch. Matto found this near the river before the soldiers came. He thought it looked pretty. Her voice weakened slightly. I kept it after he died because it was the last thing he touched. Elias looked toward the tiny burned shoes resting partly visible inside the leather bag. Something inside him twisted painfully then. A child found a lost watch. Greedy men searching for stolen money destroyed everything around him afterward. Same old story the frontier kept repeating beneath different names. Elias rubbed one rough hand slowly across his jaw. So Reed thinks you know where the gold is. He thinks everybody lies the way he does. Elias stared toward the dark windows while thinking. Outside, snow covered the ranch yard in pale silver beneath moonlight. Somewhere beyond those hills sat a world full of cruel men chasing money and ghosts. Yet inside this house sat a woman coughing blood into cloth while carrying the ashes of her child through winter storms. Funny thing about judgment. It always looked simpler from far away. Nayeli suddenly coughed hard again, doubling slightly forward in the chair. Elias stood immediately and crossed beside her before she could wave him off. Her breathing sounded rough now, shallow and strained. Fever heat rose visibly from her skin despite the cold room. Enough, Elias muttered. You are seeing that doctor. Nayeli shook her head weakly. No hospitals. Blackstone is not a hospital. Still smells like one. Elias crouched beside her chair, his voice firm now. You keep fighting sleep, fighting warmth, fighting help. But this thing in your lungs is winning. Nayeli looked toward the fire silently. Tears glimmered faintly in her tired eyes, though none fell. Maybe I am just tired of surviving. Those words hit Elias harder than he expected. He looked away toward the stove for a second before answering quietly. Surviving is ugly work sometimes. The fire cracked softly between them. But it is still work worth doing. Nayeli stared at him carefully after hearing that. Something changed in her expression then. Not hope exactly, but maybe the memory of it. Elias stood and grabbed his coat from the wall hook. We leave at first light. Elias. No arguments. He moved toward the cupboard gathering supplies while speaking. Blackstone is 20 miles east. Roads will be rough after the storm. Nayeli coughed weakly into the quilt around her shoulders. And if Reed follows? Elias reached for his rifle near the doorway. Then he follows. Simple answer. Quiet answer. But something about hearing it made Nayeli lower her eyes quickly afterward. Like nobody had ever chosen her safety over convenience before. Wind rattled the windows softly while Elias packed dried meat, blankets, and lantern oil into an old saddlebag. Outside, the ranch looked frozen beneath moonlight. Silent. Isolated. But no longer empty. Elias noticed that now every time he walked through those rooms, the old loneliness had changed shape. Harder to carry somehow, because another heartbeat existed beside his own. Nayeli watched him from the chair beside the fire while exhaustion slowly pulled at her eyes. Why are you helping me? She whispered finally. Elias paused beside the table. Strange question. Hard one too. He looked toward the old photograph of his wife still resting inside the open tin box. Then toward the tiny burned shoes beside Nayeli's chair. Because somebody should have helped you sooner, he answered quietly. Nayeli looked down immediately after hearing that. Firelight danced softly across her face while the storm clouds finally began clearing beyond the ranch windows. And for the first time in many years, Elias Turner realized he no longer feared silence inside his home. He feared losing the voice that had finally broken it. They left before sunrise beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Frost covered the ranch fences, and the horses breathed white clouds into the freezing dark while Elias Turner tightened the saddle straps with stiff hands. The world felt silent in that hour before dawn, when even the wind seemed too tired to move. Nayeli sat wrapped in the blue quilt near the porch steps, weak from another sleepless night. Her cough had worsened by morning. Twice Elias heard blood in it again while packing supplies into the saddlebags. Each time she turned away quickly, embarrassed by her own sickness. Elias hated that look most of all. Nobody should feel ashamed for hurting. He handed her a tin cup of hot coffee before mounting his horse. You ready? Nayeli stared toward the pale horizon where the first thin line of sunlight touched the desert hills. I forgot what ready feels like. Elias studied her quietly for a moment before stepping down from the saddle again. Without speaking, he removed the thick wool scarf from around his own neck and wrapped it carefully over her shoulders beside the quilt. Nayeli looked surprised. You will freeze. I grew up in this weather. She touched the scarf gently. Still, Elias adjusted the saddlebag straps one final time. Still nothing. The ride toward Blackstone began slowly through frozen trails and snow-covered brush. The doctor lived 20 miles east beyond Dry Creek, near the railroad line cutting through the territory. Long ride in summer. Worse in winter. Elias kept the horses moving steady across the open plains while weak morning sunlight spread across the desert around them. Snow glittered beneath the light like broken glass. Nayeli rode beside him silently beneath the scarf and quilt, one hand resting against the leather bag tied securely at her side. Every now and then Elias glanced toward her without making it obvious, watching her breathing, watching her shoulders sway slightly from exhaustion in the saddle. She looked too fragile for this cold world. Strange thought for a man who once believed tenderness only made people weak. By midday the wind returned hard across the plains. Dry winter gusts swept snow into the air and blurred the trails ahead. Elias pulled his coat tighter while leading the horses through a narrow canyon road lined with dark stone cliffs. "We rest soon," he called over the wind. Nayeli shook her head faintly. "Keep moving. You can barely sit upright. If we stop, I may not get back on the horse." Elias looked toward her sharply after hearing that. She was not complaining, not dramatic, just honest. That frightened him more. They reached an abandoned trading post around noon and finally stopped beside the broken remains of an old wooden stable. The roof sagged beneath snow while loose signs creaked softly in the wind overhead. Elias helped Nayeli down from the saddle carefully. The moment her boots touched the ground, her knees nearly gave out beneath her. Elias caught her quickly by the arms. For a second, she leaned heavily against him while struggling for breath. Her body felt frighteningly light beneath the quilt. "Easy now," he muttered quietly. Nayeli closed her eyes briefly. "I hate this." Elias guided her carefully toward the stable wall where the wind could not hit as hard. "Hate what?" Feeling weak, Elias removed a canteen from the saddlebag and handed it to her. "Everybody gets weak eventually." Nayeli gave a faint bitter smile. "Not men like you." Elias looked out across the empty snow-covered desert before answering. "Especially men like me." The wind moaned softly through broken wood beams overhead. For several moments neither spoke. Then Nayeli reached slowly into her leather bag and removed the small carved wooden horse that once belonged to Maddo. She stared at it quietly in her hands. "My son used to say winter made the world honest." Elias sat beside her against the stable wall. "How so?" Nayeli brushed her thumb gently across the little carving. "Because cold strips everything down to what matters." Elias looked toward the open plains beyond the ruined trading post. Funny thing was, she was right. Winter did not care about money or pride or skin color. Cold humbled everybody the same way. Rich men froze. Poor men froze. Lonely men froze hardest of all. A sudden cough bent Nayeli sharply forward before she could stop it. Elias grabbed her shoulder immediately while she struggled for breath against the freezing air. Blood stained the snow near her boots this time, bright red against white ground. Elias felt something cold twist deep inside his chest. "Enough," he said firmly. "We are getting you there today, even if I have to drag the damn horse myself." Nayeli wiped her mouth shakily. "Why?" Elias frowned. "What kind of question is that?" Her tired eyes lifted toward him slowly. "Why does my life matter this much to you?" Wind drifted softly through the broken stable around them. Elias stared at her for a long moment before answering. Truth sat there waiting now, hard to ignore anymore. "Because that ranch stopped feeling dead after you walked into it." Nayeli looked down immediately after hearing those words. The wooden horse trembled slightly in her fingers. Neither of them spoke again for several seconds. Then from somewhere beyond the canyon trail came the faint sound of another horse approaching through the snow. Elias stood instantly. One hand moved toward the rifle resting beside the saddle. The hoofbeats grew louder slowly. Deliberate pace. Not hiding this time. Nayeli's face lost color immediately. "Elias." He stepped in front of her without thinking. The rider finally appeared through drifting snow at the far end of the canyon. Silas Reed. Same dark coat. Same calm eyes beneath the winter sky. He stopped his horse 30 feet away and looked at the two of them quietly. "You should have stayed at the ranch," Elias said coldly. Reed glanced toward Nayeli. "I told you dangerous men were coming." Elias narrowed his eyes. "You are the dangerous man." Reed shook his head slowly. "No, rancher. I am the warning." Wind howled through the canyon, then while snow drifted between them. Reed reached slowly into his coat again, but this time he removed no papers. Instead, he pulled out a small silver badge carrying a federal marshal seal beneath the frost. Elias stared at it silently, while Reed's voice lowered against the cold air. The men hunting her are closer than either of you realize. The silver marshal badge caught pale winter light beneath the drifting snow while Elias Turner stared at Silas Reed across the canyon trail. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Wind pushed through the rocks with a low, hollow whistle, carrying cold deep enough to numb fingers beneath leather gloves. Nayeli sat weakly beside the stable wall, clutching the quilt around her shoulders while her breathing struggled against the freezing air. Reed lowered the badge slowly back into his coat. "I did not come to arrest her," he said quietly. Elias kept one hand near the rifle. "Then why follow us?" Reed looked toward Nayeli before answering. "Because the men behind that missing payroll finally resurfaced last month near Tucson." Nayeli closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. Reed continued, speaking over the wind. 3 former transport guards. 1 banker from Santa Fe. They spent years hiding stolen Army gold through mining towns and border camps. Elias frowned slightly. "And where does she fit into this?" Reed's expression hardened. "One dying Apache woman is the last witness connecting them to the fire near Red Mesa." Silence settled heavily after those words. Elias slowly looked toward Nayeli. Her face had gone pale beneath the scarf and quilt. "You never said witness," he muttered quietly. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the snow. "Witnesses do not live long out here." Reed nodded once. "Especially when rich men start worrying about prison." Snow drifted softly across the canyon floor while Elias thought. Nothing about this felt simple anymore. What began as loneliness and a winter marriage had become something darker, larger. Yet standing there beside Nayeli, Elias realized none of it changed the one truth that mattered most. She was sick, frightened, and hunted by men with more power than mercy. Reed stepped slowly from his horse. "There is a telegraph office in Blackstone," he said. "I can wire federal authorities from there. Get her protected." Nayeli looked up sharply. "No," Elias glanced toward her. "Nayeli. No marshals. No army." Her voice shook beneath exhaustion. "Every uniform brings more fire." Reed studied her silently for a moment. Then his tone softened slightly. "I know what happened near Red Mesa." Nayeli froze. Wind pushed loose snow around their boots. Reed removed his hat slowly. "I saw the camp after the smoke cleared." Something changed in his face then. Old guilt maybe. Old regret. "I should have stopped it sooner." Elias watched him carefully now, noticing details he missed before. The tired eyes. The weariness in the man's shoulders. This was not a hunter chasing reward money anymore. This looked like somebody trying to outrun his own conscience. Nayeli's breathing weakened again beside the stable wall. Elias crouched beside her immediately. "Easy." She pressed one hand against her chest while coughing roughly into the quilt. Fresh blood stained the fabric near her fingers. Reed's jaw tightened after seeing it. "Doctor in Blackstone will not help if she gets much worse," he said quietly. Elias looked toward the distant hills beyond the canyon. Blackstone still several miles east. Daylight fading already beneath gathering clouds. "Then we move now," he muttered. Reed stepped aside immediately. "There is a shorter trail through the North Ridge." Elias narrowed his eyes. "And why would I trust you?" Reed looked toward Nayeli. "Because the men following her are probably less than a day behind." Silence again. Heavy one this time. Elias helped Nayeli slowly back onto the horse while her hands trembled from weakness. She barely had strength to hold the saddle horn anymore. The sight tightened something deep inside his chest. He remembered the woman who first arrived at his ranch sleeping beside horses beneath freezing skies. Proud, distant, refusing help. Now winter itself seemed to be pulling her downward one breath at a time. The ride through the North Ridge Trail felt endless. Snow thickened across narrow paths while gray clouds swallowed most of the afternoon light. Reed rode ahead, silently guiding them through frozen canyons and rocky slopes, known mostly to hunters and smugglers. Elias stayed close beside Nayeli the entire time. Several times her body swayed dangerously in the saddle before he steadied her again with one hand. Finally, near sunset, the railroad town of Blackstone appeared through the snow below them. Smoke rose from iron chimneys beside the tracks while lanterns flickered alive along muddy streets. The distant sound of a train whistle echoed across the valley. Elias exhaled quietly. Almost there. But Naeli never answered. Elias turned immediately toward her. Her eyes had closed, skin pale beneath the scarf, one hand slipping weakly from the saddle horn. Naeli. No response. Panic moved through him sharp and sudden. He caught her before she fell from the horse completely. Damn it. Reed dismounted quickly beside them. She is burning with fever. Elias lifted Naeli carefully into his arms. She felt frighteningly light. Now beneath the quilt, like winter itself, had already started carrying pieces of her away. Blackstone's doctor office sat near the rail station beneath a faded wooden sign swinging in the wind. Elias pushed through the front doors hard enough to rattle the windows. Warmth and the smell of medicine hit instantly. An older doctor with silver hair looked up from behind a desk cluttered with papers and bottles. Help her, Elias said immediately. The doctor stepped forward quickly while Reed closed the door against the storm outside. Naeli coughed weakly against Elias's coat before her strength finally gave out completely. The doctor guided them toward a small examination room lit by lanterns and coal heat. Lay her here. Elias lowered her carefully onto the narrow bed while the doctor checked her breathing. Silence filled the room except for wind outside and the ticking of an old wall clock. Finally, the doctor straightened slowly. His face looked grim beneath the lantern light. She should have come weeks ago. Elias felt his stomach tighten. Can you help her? The old doctor removed his glasses carefully. Maybe. One word. Quiet word. But heavy enough to drain all warmth from the room. Elias looked toward Naeli lying pale beneath the blanket while weak breaths lifted her chest unevenly. Outside, snow continued falling across Blackstone beneath the dark Arizona sky. Reed stood silently near the doorway with his hat in both hands while the old clock kept ticking softly against the wall. Then the doctor spoke again. Treatment will cost money. Medicine came in on the railroad last week. Elias looked up immediately. How much? The doctor hesitated. More than most ranchers carry in winter. Elias did not even blink. Tell me anyway. The doctor removed his glasses slowly while the old wall clock ticked against the silence. Snow drifted past the windows outside the clinic, pale beneath the lanterns along Blackstone's muddy streets. Elias Turner stood beside the narrow bed, watching Naeli breathe through shallow, fevered breaths beneath the blankets. She looked smaller now somehow, fragile in a way that frightened him more than gunmen or storms ever could. The doctor cleared his throat quietly. Medicine alone will run close to $80. Elias did not react. And if her lungs worsen? The old man hesitated. Then she will need more than medicine. $80 might as well have been $800 in winter. Most ranchers barely survived until spring as it was. Feed costs, broken fences, sick cattle. The frontier drained men one season at a time. Elias looked down at Naeli while she slept weakly beneath the lantern glow. Strands of dark hair rested against her pale face, and even in sleep one hand remained wrapped tightly around the leather bag beside her chest. He thought about the first night he found her outside beside the horses. Thought about the tiny burned shoes hidden inside that bag. Thought about how quiet the ranch used to feel before she arrived. Do whatever she needs, Elias said finally. The doctor studied him carefully. You understand what that may cost? Elias nodded once. I do. Reed stood silently near the doorway while the doctor gathered supplies from a cabinet lined with medicine bottles. Finally, Reed spoke quietly. You planning to sell cattle? Elias shook his head. No time. Winter market already closed. Reed looked toward him carefully. Then what? Elias stared through the clinic window toward the snowy streets outside Blackstone. I still got horses. Silence settled briefly after that. Reed understood immediately. A rancher without horses was like a preacher without a Bible. It meant survival got harder. Lonelier too. But Elias never looked away from Naeli while speaking. She stays alive. That was all he said. Outside, evening settled fully across Blackstone while snow softened the sound of the town. Elias spent the next 2 hours walking through freezing streets beneath railroad lanterns, selling nearly every horse he owned except the old gelding that carried him through winters for years. One by one, the stable hands led them away into the storm while Elias signed papers beside the feed store without bargaining once. The final horse to leave was the chestnut mare Naeli used during the ride from the ranch. Elias rested one rough hand briefly against the animal's neck before letting the reins go. Strange thing about sacrifice. Real sacrifice never sounded dramatic. It sounded like silence after hoofbeats disappeared. By the time Elias returned to the clinic, snow covered his coat and beard completely. The doctor sat near the stove writing notes while Reed smoked quietly beside the window. Nayeli remained asleep beneath clean blankets, though her breathing sounded steadier now. The doctor looked up immediately. Medicine is helping the fever. Elias removed his gloves slowly, hands red from cold. She going to make it? The old doctor leaned back thoughtfully. If she rests, eats properly, stays warm. He paused before adding quietly. And if fear stops chasing her every night. Elias glanced toward Nayeli after hearing that. Funny thing was, he understood exactly what the doctor meant. Some sickness lived deeper than lungs. Reed stepped away from the window then. I wired federal contacts in Tucson, he said. Those men hunting her will not move openly anymore. Elias frowned slightly. You trust the law that much? Reed gave a tired half-smile. Not particularly. Wind brushed softly against the clinic windows while lantern light flickered warm across the room. Elias finally sat beside Nayeli's bed for the first time all night. Exhaustion settled heavily into his shoulders now. Winter, fear, worry, all of it catching up at once. He looked at the leather bag resting near her hand and gently moved it closer so she could reach it easier in her sleep. Small gesture, quiet one. But the moment his fingers touched the worn leather, Nayeli stirred awake. Her eyes opened slowly beneath the lantern light. Confused at first, then calmer once she saw him beside the bed. Elias. Her voice sounded weak and rough from fever. You are still here. Elias nodded lightly. Doctor says you are too stubborn to die. A faint tired smile touched her lips. Maybe he does not know me very well. Elias poured fresh water into a cup and handed it to her carefully. Their fingers brushed briefly in the lantern glow. Warm touch. Human touch. Simple thing most people never noticed. But for two lonely souls who spent years surviving without kindness, it felt strangely important. Nayeli looked around the small clinic room quietly. Where are the horses? Elias leaned back in the chair. Gone. Her eyes lifted toward him immediately. Elias. He shrugged lightly. Ranch still got fences. Still got sky. Nayeli stared at him silently for several seconds before tears finally gathered in her tired eyes. Not loud crying. Just quiet grief from someone unaccustomed to being chosen over money. Nobody ever gave things up for me before, she whispered. Elias looked toward the snowy window instead of her. Then the world has been meaner to you than it should have been. Silence filled the room softly afterward. Outside, the storm finally began clearing above Blackstone. Moonlight touched the snow-covered streets in pale silver while the distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the night. Nayeli slowly reached into the leather bag and removed the tiny burned shoes one last time. She held them gently in her lap while staring down at them beneath the lantern glow. Elias remained quiet beside her. After a long moment, Nayeli whispered, I think Maddo would have liked your ranch. Elias swallowed slowly. Yeah. She looked toward him then. Especially the horses. For the first time in many years, Elias Turner laughed softly. Small sound, rusted from disuse, but real. Nayeli smiled faintly after hearing it. Then carefully, almost reverently, she placed the tiny shoes back inside the leather bag and rested it beside the bed. Outside the clinic window, dawn slowly began touching the snowy Arizona horizon. Another winter morning arriving quietly over the frontier. And somewhere deep inside himself, the lonely old rancher realized something unexpected had happened during those cold weeks beside the fire and snow. The house waiting for him back home no longer felt like a place where people survived alone. It finally felt like somewhere two wounded souls might learn how to live again. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.